So welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We will resume now with day 2 of our NG112 event. As many of you know, we in Europe, we talk about NG112, and actually the work behind that in terms of the standards, etc., is based on North American standards for NG911. So you know, the thinking and the progress of projects is a little bit further ahead in the US and Canada. And I'm very happy now to welcome William Ewell, Director of Office of Statewide Emergency Telecommunications in Connecticut, in the USA. And William is going to share the experience in Connecticut of deploying next generation 911. So Bill, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Very clear.
Great, thanks. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. Really appreciate it. My presentation is a little bit different in that it's a bit more of a story. We were early adopters of NG911 and we've learned a lot. My hope is that based on the story, I'll share that some of these learnings and takeaways are useful to you as you deploy your own versions of the system. So with that, I'll proceed. The agenda is a quick background on the state of Connecticut, what our division does and its responsibilities, the story of our deployment of next generation 911. So a quick look at some of the other projects and initiatives we have underway. And finally, the important points are learnings and hopefully some recommendations you might be able to use. So let's take a look at Connecticut. It's a very small state, as you can see on the map. We have approximately 3.5 million people, 5,500 square miles, 169 fiercely independent towns, and that plays into the number of PSAPs, which we currently have 106 in our very small state. So you can imagine the complications we run into. But first, before I get into the detail, some quick Connecticut trivia to share with you. We were the home of the first telephone exchange in the United States in 1878 in New Haven. Also home to the first nuclear submarine, the Nautilus. We still have the oldest continuing newspaper in the country at the Hartford Courant. We were home to the hamburger, the Polaroid camera, and the Frisbee. And finally, there's still a law in the Hartford Capitol books which says it is illegal to cross the street walking on your hands. Please don't ask me a question about that one. I have no idea. Okay, so the state of Connecticut, we manage the system for the entire state. So we deploy all the equipment and all the networking. We don't run the dispatch centers or the PSAPs themselves, but we are a statewide provider of the system. Again, as I spoke, we have 106 PSAPs. We process approximately 2 million 911 calls per year, and 83% of those are wireless currently. So we're funded by a surcharge. It applies to wireless, wireline, VoIP phones, as well as prepaid cards. Currently, we're at a surcharge of 68 cents per line. We have a statutory cap of 75 cents, which means we cannot exceed that when we submit our annual budget. If we try to, it needs to be legislated, and which is a very tedious and difficult process. Where our budget is currently $33 million, and some of the funding that we are responsible for is, of course, the next generation system, the public safety data network, which I'll share with you in a few moments. We sponsor and fund an emergency notification system statewide. We offer PSAPs subsidies and grants. We perform radio frequency coordination on a multi-state basis. We have a GIS function. We perform dispatcher training, public education, and more. So quick background on me, 30 years on the dark side. I learned that term when I came to state service after working in the telecommunications industry for that period of time. But I think it's somewhat in jest, but on the other hand, I think it was very helpful having that background when you become a customer, because it's a different way of looking at things, and I'll share some of those learnings with you as we move forward. So I'll give you a second to look at this slide. Positive experiences deploying next generation 911. Well, it wasn't all bad, but we were early adopters and we had some things go quite wrong during implementation, which I'll share with you. Our desire to move to next generation 911 was not for necessarily for reasons of features and the like. It was really about a pragmatic reason. We had a legacy system which was in place for many, many years, obsolete, manufacturer discontinues. We had no spare parts to speak of, and literally our technicians were going to eBay to try and source parts to keep the system together. So obviously we needed to move forward. Prior to my arrival, there were several attempts at a request for proposal to replace the system. The first time the proposal was disqualified because there was an attempt to separate equipment and network when the RFP was specified that it has to combine the solutions exclusively. So we were disqualified by our own state agency and had to redo it. The second attempt, the staff attempted to include a host of I3 standards, many of which weren't even available back at that time, 2011 or 12, and the vendors priced the responses accordingly to cover themselves, and it's understandable. So it was grossly unaffordable. So we regrouped again and kind of backed up and stopped everything and restarted. So what we did is we created a request for information, and there's a delineation here. The RFI process is much more flexible in where we work as opposed to the RFP, which is inflexible on how you deal with the vendors and the carriers. So in the RFI process, we were allowed to bring in vendors for question and answer. We could have product demonstrations and a lot more detail back and forth to learn a lot about the product. We also retained an outside subject matter expert to assist us in the RFI analysis and also help us create the next phase, which is the request for proposal. And then we also added PSAP representatives to the review committee to help us to make sure that from an operational side, it was what the PSAPs needed and wanted. And with that, we believe we had everything covered. So an award was issued in 2013 for both ESINet and the call handling equipment in the PSAPs. The structure is a 7-year contract with 7 one-year renewals. It seems it may be different than what you're used to, but we do many of our MIS type contracts in those kind of arrangements. We had many delays due to system problems, particularly on the call handling platform side. We did manage to route deploy the ESINet successfully. But then probably one of the worst nights of my career, it was a Friday, I'll never forget it, and I was just, I believe, opening an adult beverage when every electronic device within, I think, a half a mile of me started melting down. And our system, the new portion of our system, crashed with over 60 PSAPs of the 106 deployed. We learned after we kind of straightened the system out and stabilized it that the system would not scale to the scope that we needed. So it was a very bad night, a very bad summer. Again, we achieved stability. We backed out a lot of the overhead in the system, got things working, but we could not expand any further. I will tell you, we had significant media coverage. We'll come back and talk about that a lot. They still come to my meetings to this day. It got so much attention. But finally, that summer, we decided with the vendor that we would replace the call handling platform with a different manufacturer, a subcontractor of our vendor, but they would go to a different manufacturer, and we started deploying that. So for the next year, January to December, we deployed the new platform at all of our PSAPs. And I just point this out, during that year, we were actually managing 3 different 911 platforms during the transition. The old legacy system, which was partially deployed, the system we were taking out, and the new one going in. So needless to say, it was an exciting year. But finally, we completed in 2017. And I will say this, despite the problems, we had outstanding coordination, and that was the key to our success. The coordination between the state, our vendors, and the PSAPs themselves to help us through this and resolve the issues. So concurrently, we have another piece of our network. We also have something called the Public Safety Data Network. This is a state maintained and deployed network, and it sits between the core, the ESINet core, and the call handling platform. So it actually connects all of the PSAPs to the ESINet. And again, it's a state managed and deployed fiber platform. I share this, here's a quick snapshot. I don't expect you to see it, but you can tell just by the graphic that it's extremely complex. There's about 8,000 miles of fiber optics, hundreds of locations, and it's got, we have, in addition to 911 on this network, we also have 150 other municipal type applications currently running as well. But I bring this to the discussion just by way of talking about some of the challenges with this. First of all, there are financial challenges when you build your own network. You obviously have to do the financial, assessment, but there's some other things that we had to really worry about, and that was things like, does the IT organization from the state of Connecticut have adequate resources, quantity, skill set to maintain a system and a network like this? Is their network operations center up to speed? Their monitoring capabilities, maintenance and repair of a network like this, and really, probably more than anything, the culture of an organization to maintain truly mission critical, life and death 911 platform on a state-run network. I will tell you, we are there now, but it was quite a challenge. And it took several years to get the organization and the resources in place to truly manage that portion of the network. One of the features that obviously we deployed with the next generation 911 that's working out really well is text to 911. We deployed that in 2018. Not a high volume, but not expected to be a high volume. We're averaging 5,500 texts per year. We generated a pretty extensive media campaign, which we're really proud of. A call if you can, text if you can't. It included television, radio, billboard, cinema, websites, social media. And I'll just share with you a quick screenshot of what was on the billboards, as well as a screenshot of one of the commercials. It actually won some awards in the United States from the advertising campaign. So we're very proud of that. But I think that the main point of this service is that it has saved lives. It's particularly appreciated by the deaf and the hard of hearing community for the ability to text to 911. Some of the other initiatives and projects we have underway, disaster recovery planning. This is an ongoing it's always part of our strategic plan. We are currently running our state police troops, backing up the 911 system with microwave. We're testing some LTE in some places and always looking at other opportunities for disaster recovery to the system. We also performed a security audit. This was done a couple of years ago. We audited the next generation 911 system, our land mobile radio system, and that public safety data network, which I described to you. And candidly, we found some pretty severe and critical vulnerabilities, which have since been corrected. So I would encourage you that to consider that an audit is probably in your best interest to make sure that the system you deploy is secure. As I described, with 106 PSAPs in such a small state, consolidation of PSAPs is always a challenge. And we're always working with legislators on how to make that happen. We also are building a backup PSAP. We were awarded a federal grant 2 years ago, and we are building a PSAP in a state-of-the-art training center, which will be designed so that any PSAP in the state, if they have a long-term outage, they can come to our center and be up in an instant with all the components and be able to serve their public and answer 911 calls and dispatch from the center. So we're really excited about that. And also the sharing of the radio core. I bring this up even though it's not necessarily 911 directly related, but we just replaced and refreshed our entire radio system in the state, and we're now sharing it with the municipalities if they would like. And we have, I think, 80 some odd MOUs already in place. And the point of this is they are saving money because they're sharing our core and they don't have to build their own, but they also have statewide interoperability with their radio system that they get by sharing the system with the state. So that's another initiative that is working out really well. A couple other projects. I mentioned our ESI system. That's being replaced by the vendor in the next year from a subcontractor, ESINet, to their own hosted ESINet, and that'll be done in the next year. Once that's done, we're going to re-terminate all the carriers onto the core, but we cannot do that until the ESINet gets replaced. We are also working on an initiative for interstate border 911 transfer. We're surrounded, we're small state, and we have small states around us, but we're working with a couple right now on the process of sending 911 calls cross borders with number and location information. So that's a project that's underway. Again, I mentioned the Public Safety Data Network. That system now is 10 years old or over already, and the electronics are end of life, and we have a project and a multi-year project to refresh all of those electronics. That's a project. Outbound text. Ours is inbound SMS only. Outbound text, we're waiting on the vendor to deploy that, but we've heard from our sister states that outbound text is a really effective way of tracking abandoned 911 calls. People are much more likely to respond to a text than they are to a call back. So we're looking forward to that. And of course, multimedia, we've done some testing. But we're also working on the protocol and policy at the PSAPs, because that's also has to be part of the mix when you roll out multimedia services over 911. And then finally on this page, laptops, we are procuring 911 laptop workstations for disaster recovery. So the learnings, and I guess the key part of the discussion, what have we learned? The automatic reroute feature of NG 911 is really simple, but it's so effective, and to us it means no lost calls, and we've had case after case where there have been outages and calls rerouted automatically, or they can be done based on a threshold or time of day, but it's really an effective way, and it just makes it seamless that we're delivering the best public safety solution without losing calls. And as I pointed out, though the call volume is small, text to 911 has saved lives. And again, the deaf and hearing impaired community is really happy that we've deployed that. I do recommend the security audit. I will share with you an idea, and I don't claim credit for it. It was one of our partner states, but they actually included in their RFP the requirement for a security audit that would be paid for by the vendor, however, be performed by a third party. So interesting idea. However it's done, I would strongly recommend an audit takes place on your system. And I don't have to tell all the experts on this in this meeting, redundancy is key, and I like to describe it as much as you can afford. Some other learnings: have a good relationship with your public information office or whoever handles the media for you. You don't want to have the crisis underway and be scrambling trying to find out who you need to contact. It's just helpful to help manage issues that you have a close relationship with that office. Partnerships with vendors are the key to success, in my opinion. They want you to be successful, you want to be successful, but at the same time, they have to be held accountable. One of the ideas that we deployed, and I recommend it, Establish a vendor executive sponsor when you deploy your system. If you're positioned candidly with an account executive or an account manager, I would submit you're not high enough up the organization. Have these executive sponsors that are assigned to your project, that you have regular calls on a regular cadence. Even if everything's going fine, it's still, in fact, they prefer that, of course, but have those regular calls so that if something does go wrong, or if there's a negotiation or a contract component that is not being met, you have an avenue to address. Speaking for myself, I think it helps to have vendor experience on your team to negotiate contracts and to just understand, how the vendors, how they deploy, and it's really helpful to have that kind of experience if you can on your team. I'll go back to our experience with the Public Safety Data Network. If your jurisdiction plans on deploying its own network, aside from doing a deep financial analysis on whether it makes sense versus a vendor deployed and supplied network, make sure that you truly have the resources, the policies, and the culture in place to maintain a mission critical network such as 911. Again, I know you know this, but we still are in kind of a niche industry. There are many small players. Make sure they have adequate resources. And a complete solution we found may require multiple vendor partners. Investigate those relationships ahead of time. You cannot control them necessarily, but beware of mergers and acquisitions. It happened 3 times with one vendor in the course of our deployment. Some solutions are not tested in every scenario. I call it bleeding edge. Try to avoid that. Questions like happen to us. Does the product scale? And one of the things that I find the best thing about what we do in our industry is the pure experience and the willingness to share. And I'm sure it's the same on the other side of the Atlantic. Don't recreate the wheel. Rely on your peers, and they will help you and will learn and share whatever they can from what they have learned. Proof of concept testing is recommended if you can set up a lab or have the vendor set up a lab. Obviously, fully check resources and references, and perform a site visit. Go see the equipment in action. And having said, negotiating strong contracts, strict service level agreements goes without saying, but they are key to a successful deployment. And finally, vendor project management. This is a little one, but it's still important. Local proximity to the project is best. We started out and our project manager was 1,000 miles away. It's doable, but it's much better, especially in the heat of the moment, having your vendor right there at the table with you physically and locally with the PSAPs, so that if you can arrange that, that's best. Make sure you review the training process and procedures yourself to make sure it hits the mark for your PSAPs and dispatchers. Help desk escalation list is critical. Test it, make the phone calls. I will tell you, I started calling up, and at one point I was up at the 4th or 5th level of escalation, and one of the people answered the phone and really didn't understand why I was calling them and didn't understand why they were on the list or were not aware of it. So really test those escalation lists provided by the vendors. You might want to also consider an external subject matter expert to assist you in the process of procurement. It helped us. And then finally, again, we're a statewide provider, so our PSAPs are our customers, but we encourage those in that kind of situation to engage the PSAPs. Make sure that they're involved in the RFP development. We set up a focus group. And pilot sites are important when you start deploying. Suggest you choose friendly, technology savvy pilot sites that can work with you and work with your vendor towards the greater good. And of course, goes without saying, but frequent communication is critical during deployment and after, for that matter. So those are the learnings. As a segue to our next speaker, Budge from California, this is not Connecticut, but this is in his state, but the message is the same. every project, of course, has roadblocks. It's how you handle those roadblocks that get you across the goal line. So I do want to thank you. I'm happy to share any information that you would like. Any questions, feel free to send them along, and I'll be happy to share those answers with you.
Thank you very much, Phil. I certainly appreciate it, that this was a really frank and honest presentation. And sometimes you might think that it's more challenging to install NG911 than maybe crossing the street, walking on your hands in Connecticut. But it's I think our participants will go back to this presentation because of the learnings that you presented, and indeed, that's the sort of sage advice that we're looking for here in Europe, as as many of the countries here begin their own NG112 journey. So really appreciate that. Now, just looking at the questions, we have one from Federico Brizio from the Italian National Fire and Rescue Service. And actually, this stood out to me as well. What do you mean by laptop workstation for disaster recovery?
So our vendor has now an option where instead of a fixed workstation at the PSAP in a console, they have an option for literally a laptop that's portable, that can still answer a 911 call via Wi-Fi or LTE. And our intent is not for work at home. That's not where we're headed, but it's more about, we've had a lot of requests where some of the larger PSAPs have an emergency operations center, and they have their duplicate telephone system over there. That's where they move all of their personnel in the event of a major issue or failure, and they're really looking for a temporary setup to answer 911 calls in the event of that their system fails, or they have to vacate for whatever reason. So these laptops could be used in those kind of situations. Also, we've had cases where in a disaster, again, this is prior to us finishing our backup PSAP, which may alleviate some of the other issues. But some of the folks have described they'd like us to be in a trailer. How can we move to a trailer temporarily, whether it's for a renovation or it's an outage of some kind? So they're really just portable laptops that will give us all the same functionality of a 911 workstation fixed in a console in a PSAP.
Okay. I hope that answers your question, Federico. Yeah, I thought maybe there was a home working element to that as well, given actually some of the experiences we've had here in Europe with the COVID-19 pandemic and the need for making sort of more flexible working arrangements for PSAP delegates. Yeah.
It could end up there. I guess we're taking baby steps at this point, and just testing the technology. Over time, that may be an option. Right now, it's not in our short-term plan.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Phil. And just to recap on that, there will be challenges in the project, but remember the last slide. Eyes on the prize, as they say. So thank you very much. And now we will move to California. And I'm delighted to be joined by Budge Courier, who's the 911 Emergency Communications Branch Manager at the Governor's Office of Emergency Services in California. Budge, good afternoon or good morning to you, as it is. I would invite you now to take the floor and make your presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you all for the welcome, and I certainly echo the comments from Bill in Connecticut, where, let me make sure I get the right screen up here. Hold on a second. I echo the comments from Bill. Really, the intent of my presentation is to just give you a quick summary of where we are with our deployment, and really encourage a conversation and follow-on conversation to what we're doing and how some of the lessons we've learned here in California might be able to apply to some of what is happening in Europe. So I'm going to give a quick overview of California. We're a little larger than Connecticut. We have 449 PSAPs total in the state. Our annual call volume is 27 million 911 calls. About 83% of those as well for us are wireless devices. Our entire state is what we call E911. What that means is all of our PSAPs are accepting wireless calls at this time. Cal OES manages the entire system, so that's my responsibility. And we manage and procure all of the call processing equipment, and then we work with the PSAPs to make sure that they're, doing things operationally in alignment with the guidelines. We have a next-gen 911 solution that we're deploying. It consists of 4 regional providers, and because of our size, we did not want a single provider to have the responsibility to deliver the calls. So we have another provider that is connected to every single PSAP in the state. So each 911 center in California has 2 next-gen 911 service providers connected to it. We have over 4,000 endpoints in our network, so it's quite an extensive network. The entire network is IP version 6. We're using SD-WAN throughout the network to ensure multiple connection points that can be managed through that SD-WAN controller. Numerous vendor technologies have been integrated throughout the solution, and we're doing a true EENA i3 NG911 deployment. And that's from ingress at the carrier all the way to delivery at the PSAP. And we've also included PKI, that's private key infrastructure, so that we're issuing PSAP credentialing agency certificates throughout the network. And so you can just imagine the complexity of the network. I'm going to walk through a couple of slides here that talk about the network. So this is a pretty high level diagram of what we're doing. In the upper left-hand corner is the ingress. So this is the connectivity between the next-gen 911 system and the carriers or the service providers. So this would be wireless providers, wireline providers, and voice over IP providers would all come in. Our preference is that they would connect to us via at these points of interface, these POIs, as a SIP connection, and preferably I3 SIP, meaning the location is in the header by reference from the carrier. And I'll get back to that in a minute. But for those that are only able to connect TDM or legacy, we'll convert that into SIP and then ingress that traffic so that it's end-to-end SIP throughout the entire network. We have multiple aggregation centers, and the way these work is the primary route is through the region, and you see our 4 regions along the bottom. And so for most calls, because wireless goes primarily through the region, to get to the PSAP over here on the far right of the diagram. We've segmented the network so that there's network segmentation for ingress, network segmentation for system monitoring, network segregation for PSAP connectivity, so that our network, we don't have a single point of failure anywhere in the network, and you see multiple lines of communication going throughout the entire system. We also have the ability to bring in text to 911 into this network, which we're doing, and we're also doing a statewide alert and warning deployment, where we're leveraging the next-gen 911 system to do alert and warning. What you see here in this top piece that I've just highlighted in yellow is actually duplicated in each of the regions with dual data centers. One of our providers that we're using is entirely cloud-based, and all of these vendors that we're using are using cloud-based technology in one way or another. So really have a great partnership going on here. From a PSAP's perspective, for all 450 in the state, this is what it looks like from their perspective. We have multiple connections that are going into the PSAP. So to Bill's point, in California, we assess a surcharge on our access lines. So that's all wireless access lines for cellular, voice over IP, and wireline. We have roughly 57 million access lines in the state. So for us, a fee of 30 cents monthly brings in the revenue that we need to support our system, which is we roughly bring in pretty close to 200 million a year US to support that. And that funds everything that I'm talking about, including the legacy system. So we built in redundancy into the network. Multiple providers. You see this top one in blue. That's connected to every PSAP in the state. And then this bottom one shown in orange here would be connected regionally to every PSAP in their region. And so from the PSAP's perspective, you have as many as 7 different IP connections that are providing connectivity into that PSAP. So that if a backhoe comes along and takes out that conduit, we are also using LTE into an SD-WAN controller. There's a company that we're working with as a really robust solution that puts multiple SIM cards in an active posture so that we can integrate it into here. And in addition to this, we have a statewide microwave network that we maintain. There's over 350 microwave sites on that network, and that'll bring an additional level of redundancy into the PSAP. All of our data, every single solution is active, and then there's multiple data centers so that if one data center goes offline, it can roll over to the next one. And we've interconnected aggregation between region and the statewide provider to make sure that we don't have a single point of failure. We've tested all this in failover testing to ensure that it works. Even in mid-call, these centers can go offline and the call is still maintained. So it's a very robust solution. One of the things to think about is how are you going to make the transition? We're in the middle of the transition now. Bill has already transitioned. So for us, this is kind of front and center to what we need to be focused on. In California, the way that we're structured, we have a selective router, a legacy selective router that's an analog-based device that has point-to-point circuits that are connected to PSAPs. And when we were developing our strategy, we knew that it would take a long time for us, about a year, to transition once we started from legacy to next gen 911. So our strategy maintains all of the selective router connections that we have, and then simultaneously builds out a next gen 911 connection using that information I showed on the previous slide to build out to every single PSAP in the state. And then all we do is we swing the traffic carrier by carrier. The wireless carriers are able to direct their traffic by PSAP, so we can tell them, you know, wireless carrier, don't point your traffic to the selective router anymore, swing it down to next gen 911. And prior to that, there's a series of tests and validation that we do to make sure we're ready for that transition. So how did we get here? I wanted to let you know this is end state of where we're at, and I'll talk through at the very end of the presentation about the success we've had. But we went through a competitive bid process. We started with 8 different bidders that we went through this competitive bid process. In California, we have a regulatory body that requires tariffs to be filed. So there was a tariff process that had to be aligned with the contract process. We were very concerned about price because we can't enter into a contract that we don't have the money to pay for. And so we established not to exceed pricing. We did a tremendous amount of research to determine what this solution should cost, and then we advertised that to the bidders, and then worked through a process to make sure that we had accommodated, you know, all the tasks and all the pricing that needed to be in the solution. And they were required, these bidders were required to comply with functional requirements, and then to make the response easier to evaluate, we had narrative responses on concepts that were absolutely critical to the success of the deployment of the network, and then we evaluated their responses. We only selected qualified bidders that were NENA I3 compliant, that met all the requirements, and we had one-on-one meetings with the bidders to make sure that they understood the requirements and that they could get through the process. And a couple of key takeaways to think about when you're going through your procurement. You certainly want to require a standard. And we did not repeat everything in the standard. It's already in the standard, we just referenced the standard. Make sure that you accommodate current and future developments in the standard, and those should be at no additional cost. And put in there, if there's anything that you didn't think about that's required to deliver the solution, that's also included at no additional cost. Because what will happen is after you procure the solution and you start down the road, a vendor might hit you with a change order or a cost for additional services. And this has been really helpful for us. Make sure you're aligning with any regulatory or legislative rules or requirements, anything that you've got in place that have to be complied with. You want to make sure you reference those. We went through just a yes, no on technical response. We said, this is the requirement, yes or no. And if they answered no, they weren't eligible. We did a draft version of the procurement, and then we met with vendors one-on-one to see how close we were with the draft. We updated the process, and then we went and went through the entire procurement. You might want to be prepared for litigation. At least that's how it works here in the US. We actually got sued in the middle of our process. We were able to come out, we won that litigation, but there is some interesting tactics that that vendors will use. I thought it was rather odd, you know, to start a partnership by suing somebody, but somebody went that path. And make sure you have a good communication with your elected officials. Bill talked about the importance in Connecticut of having working with the PIO. That's absolutely essential. I completely agree with him as well. That's a really important strategy. Don't underestimate how much collaboration is going to be required. There's a tremendous amount of collaboration, not only with the PSAPs to make sure that you're meeting their operational needs, you have their buy-in, and that you're headed down the right path, but also with various vendors. These can be carriers, the telecommunication providers, next-gen 911 service providers, your call processing equipment providers that are the call handling solution, IP wholesalers that you're going to have to go out to the wholesale market, or at least your vendor will probably have to go out to the IP wholesale market and procure these services if you don't have some type of state-owned infrastructure that you can rely on. There's regulatory agencies, there's legislative officials, and then executive leadership throughout all of those different relationships that I just described. So you're going to need a robust governance structure. What we have in California, we have an advisory board that advises us on the path forward. We have a strategic planning committee. We established regional next-gen 911 task force. We have 58 counties in our state. Each of those have periodic meetings with their PSAPs. And then I have established a very deliberate process that I meet with each of the PSAPs. We do quarterly meetings. We just did a round of these. And in each of those quarterly meetings, I had over 100 different PSAPs on every single call. And it was about a 2-hour session to just give them an update on where we are on the project. So this is probably one of the more important pieces in the planning for the success of your project, because you're going to need all this support. Costs. Thought I would put together high-level cost of a size system. And obviously there's two different kinds of costs. There's one-time cost that typically involve installing the equipment initially, and then the recurring costs to maintain that service. And what we found is that each PSAP took about $75,000 in US of one-time costs just to install the rack of next-gen 911 equipment. And then the monthly recurring costs, based on the number of IP connections I have, that's about $8,000 a month at each PSAP. The next-gen core services, obviously there's a heavy investment for these companies to put that equipment in either a data center or in the cloud. And so there's a cost associated with that. And then there's a monthly recurring cost on top of that. So an example at the bottom here, if you've got 50 PSAPs with an annual call volume of 5 million calls, you can expect one-time costs of about 15.7 million, and then monthly recurring annually at about 9 million. Those are our estimates on what we used. It's going to be different based on market value in whatever nation you're located in the EU, but it's just something to take into consideration, that you're going to want to do some research here so that you have your project fully funded and you know what you're facing. This is how our state is broken up based on our regions, number of calls, number of PSAPs. Our schedule is shown in the upper right, and we think this June 2022 date is pretty realistic based on what we've seen so far, but there's a lot of moving parts, many of which are not in our direct control. So this gives you a snapshot of regionally how we're organized, and each of these regions is roughly the size of one of the typical states in the US, which is why we broke them up this way. This is our high-level timeline. You're going to want to think through this. Obviously, a project with this complexity, the way we're tracking it for execution, our tracking spreadsheet has 80 columns and 450 rows. And so you can imagine tracking that level of detail. So we use this high-level schedule here to just kind of give an overview of what the project looks like. From building the project teams, performing the site surveys, ordering the circuits, deploying the ESI net or the IP circuits in the SD-WAN, doing the actual equipment installs at the PSAP, designing and building your network operations center and your NG core services, and then doing the test and integration. And there's a tremendous amount of testing that you're going to have to do. We actually built a lab to do our testing. So we have a next-gen 911 lab where we have call processing equipment in. We're able to do end-to-end testing to validate that the solution works the way that it's supposed to. And that has been absolutely critical to the success of our project. As you prepare to go live, there's a number of considerations that you have to make. This graphic we've used as a talking point to how we're going to deploy the service. So the stuff in blue at the top is what your call processing vendor needs to do. What we've found is that our call processing equipment claims to be next-gen 911, but it's not really. There's some very significant limitations. They can be overcome by the next-gen 911 service providers, but it has caused a significant amount of delay in order to interact with those call processing equipment that's out there. You've obviously got a ton of work to do here to install all the equipment at all of your 911 centers and test and integrate the solution. And once you get the next-gen core services communicating with CPE, you then have to begin to test the incoming carrier traffic and complete everything at the PSAP so that you're aligning everything with operations. So the technology could work perfectly, but if you're not properly training the dispatchers on how to interact with the new system, how they get day 2 support for the network operations center and those other critical components, then your project won't be successful. You have to make sure you accommodate both of those. We want to let you know that this is not just a theory. It actually does work. We have successfully delivered end-to-end NENA i3 geospatial routing for multiple devices through aggregation into our next-gen core services with failover between region and our statewide provider to deliver calls to an actual PSAP out in the field. And so it does work. We expect to go live in our first 911 center probably within the next 30 days. We're being very careful not to let the date drive the process, but to let the process drive the date. And that's a fine line you've got to walk, because obviously you don't want to give the vendors an endless amount of time to complete the project. But we're really being purposeful on ensuring that the solution works, meets the operational needs, and is extremely reliable. So I know that was fast. I appreciate the time, and I want to really leave time for you all to ask questions, and hopefully you've got some good questions for me.
Thank you very much, Budge. Really great presentation, and again, lots of very useful guidance to colleagues here in Europe as they begin their NG112 journeys. You mentioned the draft RFP. That's a really good way of making sure that you cover everything first time around before you're fully committed to it. The importance of collaboration, that's something certainly that we recognize at EENA, and we're trying to really get that message out there at the beginning of the project to define all the requirements, not just the benefits of NG112, but also the operational needs, which is really important. You also provided some information on costs, which I know they relate exactly to you in terms of what your experiences are, but they do provide a good indication in terms of how to calculate what your costs might be in your country, and I think that will be very much appreciated. And also to echo a point made by Sorin Vasilka from Romania as well about the importance of investing in training and to make this work. So the idea of putting in all of this really cool kit and then not having all operators sitting there who don't know how to use it. I mean, that's, it's really important, and also just for, professional development as well for the call takers. So some really good stuff there. Now, just looking at the questions, I only see one question here. Oh no, I see there's no, it is only one question. And I think it relates to the emergency number 911 itself. Wait. Yeah, so the question is about the number, and is it the number that people call for large scale emergencies? So, not that you need an ambulance, but let's say in, like a natural disaster or forest fire or a terrorist attack or something like that.
Yeah,
I think it is in the US.
It is, yeah. So 911 is the number that you call for basically any emergency, whether it's a local emergency or a large scale emergency. So we're part of the Governor's Office of Emergency Services, and we always say that every emergency starts with a 911 call, no matter how big it is. Usually someone calls 911 first, and then you realize, oh wait, this isn't local, this is statewide. So we've had obviously some tremendous wildfires in the last year. This coming year is going to be significant, and all of those are handled through 911 and then coordinated from there. And so there is the 911 number itself is all they need to dial, and then the system will automatically connect them to the correct 911 center that needs to handle the call based on where they are on geography.
Okay. There's another question from Nate as well, and this is about who takes responsibility for paying for reserved channels for emergency communication. So I assume, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Butch.
Yeah, so if by reserved channels you mean the extra IP connections that we built into the next gen 911 system, all that comes out of the 911 fee, so we pay for that and we manage that at the state level. So the reserve capacity is built into the network, and what we did was we started with a 10 megabit pipe into every single PSAP, multiple connections. And based on today's paradigm, where you're just primarily getting audio, because the carriers are not able to send video and multimedia yet. But we built into the structure, and we built all the physical equipment, the switches, routers, and everything else, the ability to go up to gigabit speeds. And so we can immediately change out the network. It's just an ordering process on our side, and we have the funding mechanism to do that. So if we run into a capacity issue on the network, we monitor the network to make sure that the throughput is staying under acceptable thresholds, which for us, you'd want it to be about 50% of that 10 meg, so that failover works right, properly. And then we would just plus up the network from there. Our larger PSAPs, for example, LAPD has 163 positions, so it's rather large. That one obviously has gigabit connections in it, just because of the call volume and the number of dispatchers there.
Okay.
Let's see what.
Yeah, there was another question in there about how to sanction abusers of the emergency lines. I guess this is time wasters and hoax calls, things like that.
We have that. So we have built into it the ability to detect a denial of service. We also have the ability to detect what we call repeat offenders. people who call over and over and over again. We can geolocate where that call is coming from. A lot of times, you know, there's been a couple of instances where there's been somebody who has some mental health issues, and they're repeatedly calling 911 to the tune of 5,000–6,000 times a day. We're able to locate that device, and we've had success in actually finding the person with the device and, you know, getting them the help that they needed, and then stopping those calls. So we have the ability to do that, and that is built right into the system.
Okay, great. And just one final question for me, if you don't mind. One thing I found interesting in your presentation when you showed one of the network architecture slides was the notion of the software defined wide area network. I know, you know, in standardization work here in Europe, I mean, this is a buzzword, software defined networking and network function virtualization. It's nice to see it deployed. Can you tell how, or could you maybe inform us how that is, you know, of real benefit to the NG911 solution?
Yeah, sure. I don't know if I'm still sharing my screen. I think I am.
Yes, you are. Yeah.
All right. So I'll go back to this graphic up here. So the way we've done this is sitting right here. There's a software defined WAN appliance, and so to the PSAP, as it looks down this path, it appears like one IP connection is essentially the way that works. And our CPE today, our call processing equipment that's sitting over here, is pretty unintelligent. It can only really understand a single path. And so behind that is the complexity of the software defined WAN that makes all of these connections appear as one. So there's that near-term advantage. Now, we've written a cloud-based RFP for call processing, and we're moving in that direction. As soon as we get next gen deployed, we'll start that migration. So that need will not be there anymore. But the other thing that the SD-WAN controller does, when you're in a SIP session and you've got a call anchored from your core services all the way back into potentially a carrier way over here, the ability to turn off individual IP connections, yet to the SIP session, it appears that the connection is still there. That's the biggest advantage we're seeing, because I can literally turn off this single connection and it will fail over and the call isn't dropped, no audio loss, no representation of the call. I can turn off the second one and the same thing happens. And so in that way, we're leveraging the capabilities, because realistically, you're probably not going to get better than 3 nines availability on any one of these connections. But when you start to aggregate them all together, you can get to that 5, 6 nines availability that we'd all like to see. So that's one of the big advantages of it. Plus, it reduces the complexity of managing all of these individual IP connections throughout the network. It really gives you the tools you need to segment the network and manage it the way that you need to. The other thing that's been very helpful, where you have meet points between the networks, is to those meet points take advantage of a similar a similar concept, where instead of advertising a whole list of IP addresses, there's maybe a groomer behind that that's saying, okay, this is a single IP that you interact with, but really this is a load balancer that is linked to a whole bunch of other stuff. So we get the high availability we want even between data centers without revealing the complexity of this network to this network over here, which is another important concept when we're integrating these together.
Redundancy, redundancy, redundancy.
There's a lot here. Yes.
Another key takeaway, as Bill mentioned in his presentation. Okay, Butch, listen, thank you very much. That was really, really good and really, really useful. So just to cap off on today, I know we're a little bit over time. I apologize for that, but these sessions are interesting, and sometimes you want to explore some of the issues a little bit more, so and give our speakers a little bit of flexibility to explain everything on their slides. So I just want to say a big thank you to our 4 speakers today, to Michelle Monneray, to Soren Vasilka, to William Ewell, and to Budge for their really insightful presentations. So tomorrow we'll be back again for the final day of our event. We will start again at 2:30 and with a very interesting presentation from the Canadian Telecoms Regulator on implementing NG911 in Canada. And then after that, Christina and Benoit and myself will participate in a session where we will kind of reflect on the learnings of the 3 days and produce some conclusions and some things to think about as takeaways from this event, as we move towards or down the road towards our own NG112 journeys in Europe. So thanks again to all speakers. Thanks to you, the participants, for your attention, for your insightful questions. We hope that all of you will be back tomorrow for the final day of the event. And it just leaves me to say have a very good evening, and we'll see you tomorrow at 2:30. Thank you.